Thank you very much for being here and for inviting me again for the third conference. And I apologize. You'd think by the third conference I'd be able to do this in Spanish, but I haven't gotten that good yet. Maybe the fourth conference if I'm invited again. So I want to also say that I'm glad to be here, and all of you have now become part of my community. I belong to a community in the United States and Canada called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and I co-chair the green stormwater infrastructure for that group. So I have a community of municipality policymakers, and now I feel like it's reached over to Mexico, and now you are part of my community, and I'm learning from you. I am not the teacher always, and you're teaching me as well, so thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to say that I am not a researcher, and I am not an engineer, but I am, as a government official or public service person, a policymaker in which I try to use the data and the information provided by researchers and try to convert it into policy and try to implement some of those policies within the city. So as I talk about green infrastructure in this talk, it's the bigger picture and how it's connected to climate change or even weather patterns and how that affects us as individuals, our health, and then also our communities, the environmental part of it. And my former profession was a nurse, so I'm very interested in human health. But I also say, as a landscape architect, that if we take care of our environment, that's half the battle of taking care of our health. So the two go hand in hand. So what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit about changes. And I say the latest normal, because if you're familiar with the International Panel of Climate Change, Dr. Jonathan Overpeck was the writer or the author of teams that wrote that document, and they got a Nobel Prize for it. And he says there is really no new normal because normal is always changing as we discover more things and we change the way we practice in our cities. So I will also say it's the latest normal. And then a little bit about the urban heat islands. Again, the urban heat islands do not necessarily affect climate change, but climate change definitely affects urban heat islands. And as we are living in more cities, and our cities, as Maria Elena is saying, is growing, we are creating initially unintentionally these heat islands. And NASA and Berkeley Lab, as well as Oak Ridge Lab, has been studying those urban heat islands for over 50 years. And they've been doing it through satellites. And so we know that our cities are getting hotter. And that as the climate globally is getting hotter, we're going to feel that effect even more so than in other parts of the world. And then lastly, it's about community. And so how are we as policymakers and implementers affecting our community? And we're making a community here with each other and how we can support each other as well. All right, so this is what the geologists are saying. It's taken billions of years for us to get to where we are today in what we call planet Earth. And then right at the end, maybe a few 100,000 years, we have these two epochs. One is the Pleistocene, which was the formation of the glaciers, and then the Holocene, which is the glaciers now are receding. So what they're saying, and the discussion amongst the geologists now, is that for hundreds of thousands of years, we know that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere has been below 300 parts per million. And that now, in this short period of time of a few hundred years, there's been this spike. And so now the level of carbon dioxide is much higher than it's ever been in thousands of years. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that the carbon dioxide level is spiking, and there's a correlation between that level and the temperature. So we know that globally the temperature is rising as well. So what the geologists are now proposing is there's a new epoch now happening, which they are calling the Anthropocene, or some people call it the Anthropocene. So I've heard scientists pronounce it both ways. And if we look up, if you know your Latin, Anthropocene means that it's man-made. So our cities are man-made, and all of this that's happening with globally is due to some parts of what we are doing. And it may have been unintentional, but now we understand that the changes are occurring. So what we're trying to do as policymakers and as researchers is try to figure out how can we either correct the direction in which we've been going. And if you want to call it a paradigm shift, that's definitely what we're doing. All right, so they came out 2 years ago, 2014, they being this group of IPPC folks, with another report. And I'm just going to pull out of that report just what's happening in the Southwest region, because that's us here, the Southwest. You know, there's different factors happening in the Northwest or the temperate climates, but we're here in the arid Southwest. So what the report says is that it's going to impact 5 areas. And if we look at those 5 areas, the snowpacks, agriculture, coastal lines, wildfires, and then threats to human health, they all are connected to temperature and water. It has something to do with temperature and water. And again, because I'm interested in human health as well, I'm going to concentrate on the heat threats to health. So the heat threats to health, what we also know in the United States is that heat is the #1 natural disaster of death in the United States. So that's, you know, it gets hotter. Are we going to have more deaths because of that? What's also starting to creep up with this climate change is I think hurricanes and tornadoes are starting to creep up in that factor also, but heat is still there as #1. So what the document says, the document of the climate change in the Southwest, is that we're going to have higher temperatures. And what this higher temperature means is that our cities are going to get hotter. And then our cities getting hotter, it's going to have a domino effect on a lot of other things. You know, we're going to use more electricity to keep our houses cooler, keep ourselves cooler, more fuel, it may cause blackouts, and our generating plants need water to cool themselves. So it's all this domino effect, but in the end, it's going to be about death and illness, human health. But they say also, you know, they're being very optimistic, that all is not lost. We can still do something. So what they say is planting trees, shade, cooling our cities is very important, and that is one of the low-hanging fruits that we can do today. And what is it? There's a Chinese saying that says, the best time to plant a tree is today. You know, so let's try and kind of follow that, do that. So if we plant the right trees and the right kinds of trees, there was earlier at the welcome that was saying, you know, we tended to bring exotics into our cities. Well, now we know that sometimes those exotics may not be the right trees because of our temperature and our water consumption. So if we use more drought-tolerant trees, those may not be necessarily from our region, but at least they use less water. But native trees, they're adapted to this region, so let's use as many and figure out how to use those native trees. I think at the conference last year, there was a talk about vegetation. And I think one of the problems we had in Tucson early on, maybe 10, 15, even 20 years ago, is sometimes those trees are not available to you because the nurseries aren't growing them, so you can't buy them. So the push has to be that you have to ask the nurseries to grow those trees for you so you can plant them. And that's exactly what the landscape industry did in Tucson. We said, we need these trees, so the nurseries started to grow them. So that's what you have to do. And these trees in turn will be low water use, so you don't have to always irrigate them. And then so living shade, when we're growing trees and we're trying to make them healthy, right? There's a little bit of a conflict because we live in the desert, we want this shade, but water is an important resource. And so how are we going to grow our shade if we don't have the water? All right, so I listened to another climate change researcher, and he said in his talk, trees are great movers of water. So think about this. Trees are great movers of water. They're going to move all this water that we have coming down and then flooding our cities. One is that when rain falls, the leaves intercept that rain and they gently fall to the ground. And the roots in the trees absorb all that water and they move it back up into the atmosphere. And that is transpiration, and that helps to cool our communities. It's like having a swamp cooler, right? If there's a little bit of moisture in the air, a little bit of wind, we're going to be a little bit cooler than if it's dry. Although humidity is not always good. All right, so how does this connect with green infrastructure? Green infrastructure is the water resource we're going to use to grow those trees in our communities, because it's going to gather, you'll hear that during this conference, it's going to gather the rainwater, it's going to help divert our stormwater from going down into the streets and then rushing out into our other gray infrastructure. And then it's going to be that resource for shade. All right, so I work now, I've moved in various departments at the city, and now I'm in Tucson Water Department. So as a utility, what's happening, at least in the United States nationally, is this concept called one water concept. So utilities are looking at all of the water resources, not just one. They're not just trying to be separate departments of water, wastewater, and stormwater. Some cities already have all those utilities under one department. So the city of Tucson, we are the providers of the potable water. So we're already doing that. But now we're looking also at wastewater. We're doing some of that already. The city also sells the reclaimed water that we get from Pima County. But Pima County is the primary wastewater department in Tucson. So 2 different jurisdictions, 2 different water sources. Okay, so they have the wastewater. That's okay, it's not under one department, but we're talking to them about all of this. And then lastly, there's the stormwater, right? Well, that's what we're here for today. There's the stormwater. So in the United States, the utilities are looking at all 3 of these types of water resource as one. So they're trying to talk about all of them in conjunction and connection with each other, that we're not isolating one from the other. So the other thing I want to make a point about green infrastructure, because I work with someone in the flood control district. Flood control looks at the big picture, the volumes, the huge mass of flooding that happens or could happen in a city. When we talk about green infrastructure, we're looking at a different scale. So we're looking at the scale of events, whether it's a small event, maybe ½ an inch or less. Pima County flood control looks at events that are 1 inch or more, because that's going to be gushing water. If you try to control those large events with green infrastructure, you're going to get blown out. You know, you're just going to blow those infrastructures out. So you have to keep in mind what event you're designing for. So what we say when I work with Pima County flood control, what we looked at is, where does most of the rain fall? So 85% of the rain that comes down in Tucson is ½ an inch or less. So that's what we're trying to capture, that ½ inch with the green infrastructure. So where the curve starts to go up, we're not concerned with that. Pima County flood control is going to control that one. They're going to build the big stormwater basins for that. But we want to capture as much as possible the ½ inch or less. So what have we done? Just a little run through what we've done in Tucson to give you a little background. First, working with another landscape architect in the Department of Transportation in the city. He had been trying, before I even came to the city, to put some development standards in place. So then I came, and then I think at the first conference I said, You know, the lesson we learned from that was engineers like to talk to engineers. So what we did is we started talking to the engineers in Portland and Seattle and sending our engineers to talk to them. And then they're like, oh, okay, it can happen. So it started happening in Tucson. We started developing standards. The standards were available, and now these standards are now available also for the residential communities. And the volunteers have been using those standards in their neighborhoods. All right. So then what we started doing is all of those standards are now available, and the community rallied up and they started doing volunteer work, watershed management, Joaquin Murrieta, all part of it. You know, the communities had volunteers, they're doing their green infrastructure work, they're doing sweat equity, and we started developing more rain gardens in ward offices. Ward offices is the city government offices. And then what we're trying to prevent is in the neighborhoods for all this silt to come down. We're trying to prevent that. It's not always going to happen because if we have the large events, it's still going to happen. But what we're trying to do is avoid it during the small events. All right, but we're also learning as we're going along because we do know that there's the back end that you can put it in, but you also have to figure out how to maintain it. So part of our big push right now is what are the maintenance, how much is that going to cost, and how are we going to do it, and how often are we going to do it. So my network with the national folks, you know, Philadelphia and Seattle are sort of the poster child of maintenance, but they have a really huge budget. You know, we have like almost zip budget. So we're trying to figure out how to do it and how to get that revenue stream and where it should come from. So the community, it's not just the neighborhoods, it was even the public officials. We got out there too, and we built our own and adopted our own green infrastructure projects. And we're doing a terrible job at maintaining it. You know, there's weeds coming up, but we're trying. And then neighborhoods have been also not only with the Department of Transportation, but Parks and Rec. They've been joining forces with them. And so in conjunction, doing a lot of green infrastructure projects to either create plazas or parks. And again, that open space that's so necessary and important for neighborhoods. All right, so, you know, green infrastructure is not really new. There was a development in Tucson that happened like in the late 1990s, about 97, 98, Savano, and these developers were ahead of their time, and they designed green infrastructure into their development without any regulations. And it's very successful. If you come to Tucson, you should try and visit Savano. They have built pathways along their green infrastructure where the drainage runs out. There's little ripples and they hold it back so that the water can sink in. And then of course we have the University of Arizona. They're trying to be a leader and trying to create more demonstration projects. And then if you came last year, you visited the garden off of the architecture building, and that was a phenomenal job. Let's see, I think in the early 2000s, about 2000, 2002, the University of Arizona, the SWES program, Soils, Water, and Environmental Research Department, created a rainwater harvesting module. So students could sign up and actually take a class on rainwater harvesting. That class still goes on. Dr. Riley was sort of the inspiration and got it started. And now the latest building, the ENR2, the Environmental and Natural Resource Building 2 is the newest building on campus, opened last year, and it is a showcase of environmental rainwater harvesting. From the roof goes down into the patio in the middle. There's cisterns. There's an underground cistern where they pump water back up and harvest it to irrigate the plants. What we're sort of learning on that project right now is the plants. Because it's in a patio that's largely shaded, they've had to replace the plants, but it's an iterative process. So we're learning as we go along what are the best plants to use. All right, so where did we go from there? We have standards, we have people sort of voluntarily doing these green infrastructures. So the city now in 2010 developed an ordinance. So now we have an ordinance, but it's only for commercial developers. And commercial developers now have to harvest 50% of the water that they need for their site. They already have requirements to put plants on their sites. So 50% of that irrigation has to come from rainwater. What this ordinance did that I thought was groundbreaking for us was we're now actually quantifying that water. So developers have to quantify how much water that they're capturing and putting back into the landscape. It was pulling teeth and a lot of give and take on how to develop that table in order to figure out that water use. Because the difficulty with creating a water budget in the urban environment is we don't really have good data about what plants in the urban environment need in terms of water sources. Department of Agriculture has great data on how much water crop fields need to take. And so farmers know how much water they need to grow their crops, but we don't have that kind of data for the urban area. So we sort of extrapolate a little, and we take a little about what farmers need and try to figure out then what is it that we need for urban vegetation. But that was, for me, really phenomenal because now landscape architects, we as landscape architects have to design knowing what that number is as well. So the Department of Transportation went one step further, and we don't have ordinances for ourselves, for the government, but we have what we call in transportation active practice guidelines. So these are policies, and every time the street department goes out to build a new road, they have to follow those policies that they put upon themselves. So we have what's called active practice guideline, Green Streets Policy. And when we bring a consultant on board, they also have to follow those policies. And basically what we're doing is we're trying to put more green infrastructure on our arterials. So remember, the other design standards were for residential streets, but now we're trying to put them on arterials, the big streets. What we found in the top photo on Houghton Road, we were trying to use more native vegetation, and part of that native vegetation was native grasses. Well, we had a pretty good rain a couple of years ago, and our grasses came up a lot faster than we thought they would come up. The grasses are good. It stabilizes the soil. It helps the water get retained. But what it didn't do, and what we found we did not do a good job, is educate the public. Because now the public that was driving these streets were saying, why don't you cut those weeds down, right? Let's cut them down, you know. So we had to go back and retrace our tracks and do more public education to say, these are native grasses, we're not going to cut them down, we're not going to spray them with herbicides, and this is what we're trying to do in order to make our streets better and to capture that water and to provide more shade for the community. And you know, now it's becoming a little bit more acceptable. So it's just that education and trying to get people to buy into all of that. All right, so how does this all fit in socially with us? Right, what we see from the planning world is that three-legged stool, the social, the economic, environment, and how does that fit in with green infrastructure? When we did our cost benefit for our streets, what we found from the social aspect was that there was some avoided cost in using water, so we're not using the potable water. And then of course, we're providing some recreation opportunities. People have walking spaces, and then also we're creating more shade for the community, and then that is good for public health. Walking and all that sort of stuff. So from the environment, because of the trees, we're reducing our carbon, and we're also creating habitat. So some of our songbirds are coming back, you know, the butterflies are coming back. Lizards, okay, maybe you don't like lizards, but you know, lizards eat bugs, so they're good too. So some of that green infrastructure in the rocks are good lizard habitats. And then, of course, water, we're not quite sure how much water quality improvement we're having. We have to still do the metrics for that. But what I hear from other cities around the United States is it is helping with the water quality. And then, of course, we're providing that water back into the environment without washing it away from impervious surfaces. And so the economic side, there's going to be a talk tomorrow about the economics of open space. But also, when you put great infrastructure in, you have to go in and you have to replace it. Being in the water department, we're going through right now trying to replace old water mains so that they don't break. And then with Flint, Michigan, having their whole issue about lead in their pipes come to the forefront. The city of Tucson is now going through and trying to find all of our lead pipes and replacing those. So infrastructure in the gray side has a lot of costs that we're now trying to catch up with. And then as a public servant, you know, we collect taxes and we use those monies. It's all of your monies, all of the people who live there. And so we have this responsibility that we use the money as wisely as we can. So we want to make sure that what we put in place is going to be good for the community and that the people who live in that community realize how their money is being spent. And then water security, water resource is a very important part. So if we can get all of these things right, maybe some of those intersections we can start talking about or addressing environmental justice, you know, and how are we doing that, as well as are we doing it right? Is there a business ethic to it? And then also energy efficiency. Are we being efficient if we do all of these things? And then if we get those things right, maybe, just maybe, we're going to help create a better community where we live, and then that in turn will connect globally, and we're creating a more resilient world. All right, this all isn't easy, but what we're all finding, and just as there are engineers here, policymakers, government officials, community people, it takes a lot of people and a lot of departments to make this happen. So I think what we're finding today, and part of that paradigm shift, is we have to interconnect with everything. So our water resources, our green infrastructure is just one part of it, but we're then going to be able to address the urban heat island as well as public health, and then our natural environment, economy, and transportation. They're all connected. This is just a small connection. You know, there's more connections than this. And all of this, right, is connected to departments and people. So in the city of Tucson, I work with all of these departments. I try to connect with all of them because they're all important, even police and fire. And actually, I was just talking to the new police chief because one of his philosophies is what's called the broken window philosophy, that if you take care of your environment and make it look good, you can divert certain types of crime. And our police chief believes in that. So he believes that if we can keep a good and healthy city environment, that will help reduce certain types of crime. So it's working with all of these departments, and this is just within the city. What I don't show here is all of those connections to the community. All of you who are out there implementing, working with the community, working with the volunteers, that they're all important. The businesses, they're all important as well. So that's it, the connections. So the rest of the time is I put my little earpiece in just in case somebody asks me a question in Spanish. All right.